even if Aaron Rodgers doesn't play at an MVP level this year, he'll still be a big upgrade for the Jets at quarterback. And the Jets have brought in a lot of pieces to support him on offense. Let's break down the Jets offseason moves on offense today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, June 6th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On today's show, I'm joined by my friend MacGregor Wells, who writes with me at GanggreenNation.com, and we're going to discuss what the Jets did this offseason on the offensive side of the ball, and I will play the role of the White Knight defending the Jets, talking about some positivity. MacGregor takes a bit of a more skeptical look. It's a good discussion, and that's ahead here on today's show. We're joined today by my friend MacGregor Wells, who writes with me at GanggreenNation.com. We're going to talk about some of the moves the Jets made this offseason. MacGregor, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's always my pleasure, John.
All right, so I guess big picture, give us some thoughts on what you think about the moves the Jets made this offseason.
Well, they lost some pieces on the defensive side of the ball. I think they lost Quinton Jefferson. They lost Bryce Huff, which I think was a bad move. They just kind of replaced with Hassan Reddick. I'm not sure that's an improvement or not, but it's certainly, you try to keep the younger guy and not make the trade as far as I'm concerned. And of course, the biggest offseason move was not really a move at all, but they get Aaron Rodgers back hopefully this season. That's the biggest improvement they're going to make. But there's a lot of optimism about the offseason, and I'm not so sure it's really justified. I mean, the biggest improvement is Aaron Rodgers, and that's not really a move the Jets made. He's just come back from an injury. I think on the offensive side of the ball, you had a huge improvement on the offensive tackles, which was nice to see, but those guys are both older and kind of injury prone lately, so who knows how long they're going to last. And I thought the draft I was not a big fan of the draft. I loved the first round pick. I'm not sure I loved much else they did after that. It was okay. I don't think it was as great as a lot of people are making it out to be. That's my impression. How about you?
I don't know. So I don't know whether I'm happy because now I get to play the role of the positive guy, or whether I'm upset because now everyone's going to be upset with you with your take on that. But I think you make a lot of interesting points. We'll go into my thoughts as we kind of go through piece by piece. So let's start with Rodgers, because I think that's the number one storyline around this team. When Rodgers comes back, I get the feeling like there's this impression around the fan base that it's a given. I feel like a lot of people, especially in the New York media, just feel like it's a given he's going to play at an MVP level. And so my thoughts on this are kind of nuanced, because I think that's a lot to ask when he's 40. He hasn't played at that level in 3 years, and he's coming off an injury. But I think some of the moves that they made on the offense, if they pan out the way they could, make it so that he doesn't necessarily need to be at an MVP level for the season to be a success. So I'm interested in your thoughts on this.
I think that's absolutely right. I think it's pretty unlikely that we're going to see MVP level Aaron Rodgers, and a lot of people are sort of making that out to be, well, it's a pretty good chance of that happening. I don't see it. I think that's very unlikely. My guess is, and it's just a guess, he's somewhere in the 10 to 15 range of NFL quarterbacks this year, which is an enormous jump from what we've seen over the past how many years, So that's a good thing. But I don't see him carrying the team like a Patrick Mahomes carries a team, or Josh Allen carries it. I don't see that it's possible, but I don't see it very likely this year from a guy who's going to turn 41 coming off a major injury.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this goes to his reputation, where he's obviously a Hall of Fame quarterback, and he obviously had a long stretch in his career where he played at that level. And I do think it's a bit much to ask, but I don't know. First of all, like you said, I mean, if he plays at the 10 to 15 level, that's an enormous improvement. In fact, there's an old expression that I've been using. even if he plays it like, even if it's between like the 15th and 20th best quarterback in the league, you can win games with that if the rest of your team is really good. And I think he's going to be better than that. And, there's an expression that, to the starving man, a bologna sandwich tastes like filet mignon. And, Jets fans, when it comes to the quarterback, we've certainly been starving for a long time. And, I think that, for me, one of the most important things this offseason was to address the offensive line. And, with the caveat that you never know how 5 guys who have never played together before are going to gel. And, there are cases in the NFL where you have good offensive lines where the individual pieces aren't that great. And you have bad offensive lines where the individual pieces look outstanding. But, I think there were some, at least on paper, upgrades made to this offensive line. And, you can start with Tyron Smith. And I remember we discussed this, offline for the start of the offseason. I think like neither of us were big fans of the idea of signing Tyron Smith, but we were also kind of like under the impression he was going to cost more than he did. And it's like, I still think that this is a move that, may or may not pan out, but like for $6.5 million guaranteed, it's almost like, well, you're in that position. You kind of have to do it when you don't have a tackle.
Yeah, it was a great move. You got to give credit where credit is due. Joe McDonald had a terrific contract with that one. But you just wonder how much he's going to play this year. I mean, it's just he's missed at least 3 games every season since I think 2015, and a lot of seasons he's missed a lot more than that. So continuity on the offensive line matters, and having him maybe not available quite a bit could be an issue. But yeah, on paper, that looks like a tremendous move. And on paper, between him and Morgan Moses and Olu Fashanu, this is an enormously transformed offensive tackle group. This is the biggest improvement of the season, other than Aaron Rodgers coming back. So yeah, on paper that looks great. I don't know how well it's going to play out in terms of health. We'll see.
But I have a couple of thoughts on that. Is first of all, there's at least like a pretty reasonable scenario you can see where this works out really well, because Tyron Smith, he was the second team All-Pro last year. He was still playing at an exceptionally high level. And I think back to a year ago, and you have Moses on the other side, who was a really solid player. And I think back to a year ago, and it's like you had to like try and talk yourself into Dwayne Brown, and you had to talk yourself into Mekhi Becton. And it's like, all right, maybe like one of these two guys, maybe if you need like one of the two to pan out, you're okay. But they needed both of those to pan out. So we've gone from a position where you're hoping things go well right now. A year ago, we were in a position where we kind of just had to hope unrealistic things were going to happen. That a 38-year-old guy coming off an injury was going to stay healthy, and a guy who hadn't played in 2 years was going to put up a good season. So I mean, I think about part of one of the things I look at is like, where were we 12 months ago? And I think I'd much rather be in this position than we were this time last year.
Oh yeah, this is a huge improvement. I mean, there's reasons to be really optimistic about this team. There's just a lot of moving parts that have to go right that you have reason to believe are not going to go right, but we'll see.
Let's focus on the positive. And actually, one of the things you mentioned is, Fashanu. And for me, the Tyron Smith thing, I feel a lot better about the tackle position having this guy you just drafted in the top 11. Otherwise, and for me, that's why, like, as we got closer to the draft, I leaned way more towards taking a tackle over taking a wide receiver, and that's why, because if everything goes well for Smith and Moses, then the line's going to look really good. But as you've laid out, there's a scenario where it's maybe arguably even a likely scenario where you can't count on that. So now at least you're not turning to Carter Warren. You're turning to a guy who's a blue chip prospect. You're turning to the guy who, after the season, you're hoping is going to lock down the left tackle position for a decade. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the tackle position is looking in very good shape as long as health holds out and you don't have this enormous drop off because of age-related issues, which you never know. These guys aren't ancient, but they're not young guys anymore. Look, I agree with you. This is an enormous improvement on tackle position. So we'll see how it works out.
And I mean, I'm not sure it was the best move, but I thought the savviest move the Jets made this offseason was trading to get back Morgan Moses, who, in hindsight, they never should have let leave after the 2021 season. But I mean, they really didn't give up much to get him. And he's not, he's not a Pro Bowl caliber tackle. He's not a rock solid, he's not a guy who's going to make any all-pro teams. But I think over the last couple of years, we've seen the value of just a guy who's a solid tackle and the guy who can stay on the field. And Morgan Moses has done both of those things through his career. So look, a good offensive line, not every piece is a star. Sometimes you just need guys who are reliable, who are, average or so players who are dependable.
Absolutely. And how many of those guys at tackle have we had recently? Pretty much none. So now we got 2 or 3. So that's great.
Yeah, I mean, if you have to go back to the Brickenshaw Ferguson days before you had a tackle, you could believe it. I mean, I guess Kelvin Beachum had a couple of good years. There's probably a couple of guys we could fill in there, and this next segment is brought to us by our sponsor, BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest. Big or small, certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let it out, especially with someone who's unbiased in your life. So today I want to tell you how I really feel about something, and you're probably thinking the same thing this week. The Jets. We have a lot of optimism for them this year, but it's been a frustrating go of it the last 13 years. This team has missed the playoffs 13 straight years. It's the longest streak in the NFL, and we're hoping that it ends this year because there's just been so much frustration. Now, that's just sports. As we all know, sports are sports. The real life is real life, though, and you may have serious things you want to talk through with someone who's unbiased in your life, and that's where BetterHelp comes in. Therapy can be different for everybody. We all have bigger problems than our favorite sports team. It's important to get things off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. So visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon. Again, it's BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Then you look at the guard position, and I guess the question is, can Elijah Vera Tucker finally stay healthy? And I'm not a doctor. I know you're not a doctor. That's one of our jokes inside jokes on in case you're not familiar with it. But I look at the AVT injuries, and these are just like freak things that like have a pretty high recovery rate for a player his age. So I don't know. Like I understand that there's risk there, and like I can't say the risk is zero, but I'm optimistic that AVT is going to be able to stay healthy and play at a reasonably high level this year.
I think that's probable. I think for the most part, most injuries are just sort of freak happenings. And there's some guys whose knees constantly blow out or something, but injuries are impossible to predict. And there's very few guys that you say these guys are just going to get injured every year. Now, Tyron Smith is one of them, but I don't know if Elijah Vera Tucker's reached that point yet. So I expect him to be probably a healthy year. On the other hand, I think Jets fans may be overestimating just how good he's been. He's shown promise, but I don't think he's been this sort of Pro Bowl level player or even shown promise of that yet. We'll see.
Yeah, I think he's been a quality starter. And I think one of the things that like goes into that is just whenever a guy plays multiple positions, you see this like whether he's on the offensive or defensive side of the ball. Whenever a guy plays multiple positions, I think the player tends to generate an inordinate amount of hype. And I don't want to say maybe inordinate's not the right word with AVT because I do think he's a good player. I think he's been very solid, but I do wonder if maybe there's been a little bit too much buzz around him just because he's moved around the line so much.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Well, I like him, but I don't. Some people sort of project him as he's sort of almost a lock to be a Pro Bowl type player. We'll see. I'm not convinced of that yet. We'll have to see how he performs.
It's a fair assessment. Talking now about the skill positions, one big move was bringing in Mike Williams this offseason. I know you were a big fan of that move, and I know you speaking about injuries, you kind of have dismissed the idea that this is a player who's overly injury prone.
Yeah, he's missed games almost every year, 1 or 2 games, but he's never been a guy that's missed a lot of time throughout his career until last year when he had a serious injury. Does that mean he's just going to never be healthy again? We'll see. I mean, look, at 30 years old, coming off a serious injury, he may never be the player he was. We don't know. But I don't think you can dismiss him as injury prone because he had 1 year with a bad injury. Lots of guys have 1 year with a bad injury. That's not injury prone. That's one bad year. So we'll see how it goes going forward. But this guy, one thing I am hopeful about is he doesn't rely on enormous amount of quickness, enormous amount of separation. So that knee injury that he suffered is not necessarily going to hurt him in the way it would hurt, I don't know, a Garrett Wilson, say, who completely relies on his ability to create separation. Mike Williams is a guy who is like a lot like Brandon Marshall, not as good, but same type of player, where he relies on bully ball and winning contested catches. And that's something that he may be able to do even if his knee is not as good as it used to be. So we'll see. But I'm optimistic he could provide something we haven't had here for a while.
That's a good phrase because I feel like he's a good complement to Garrett Wilson in a lot of ways, where Garrett, when Garrett struggles, in many cases, he's going up against the more physical press corners, because he's not super small, but he's a little undersized at the receiver position. He's not overly, he doesn't have a great upper body strength. And, a player like this, everybody always says, oh, he should bulk up. And every time a player tries that, who's like Garrett Wilson, he bulks up and he ends up being slower and it ends up kind of messing up his game. So my view was always just get a big receiver to pair with him. And I think Mike Williams fits that bill, because now when you go up against the more physical press corners, you can just stick Williams at the X, and you like Garrett have a little bit of space to maneuver behind the line. But I think Wilson, I think Williams adds other elements because like you said, he's a bully ball guy. That's not Garrett's forte. I think Garrett actually, for his size, has pretty strong hands at the catch point, but he's not. That's never going to be his game. So I think Williams just kind of adds an element that Rodgers is going to be able to use that maybe Garrett Wilson did not.
Yeah, he'll be able to use it to throw up 50-50 balls that Wilson just did not come down with those balls very often. So Mike Williams adds an element we just didn't have, which is good if he's healthy. We'll see. I mean, like I said, he's 30 years old. He's coming off a big injury. We'll see. But yeah, I'm optimistic. I think he adds a lot to this offense.
So I'm going to debate you a little bit here on one thing, is that you're saying Wilson didn't come down with those balls. I'm going to argue that's not Garrett Wilson's job. How about the guy we gave $11 million a year to last year, the big receiver who through his career has had less than a 40% contested catch rate, and that would be our good friend Allen Lazard. So I'm going to say, I'm not going to criticize Garrett Wilson. I'm going to criticize Allen Lazard, which I feel like we're always on safe ground as Jets fans. You can never go wrong criticizing Lazard.
Yeah, this guy, I've never seen someone so big play smaller than Jeremy Curley. I mean, this guy is I don't understand what he brings to the table. He's not fast. He's not quick. He doesn't create separation. He doesn't come down with 50-50 balls. He doesn't play. What does he do? He doesn't do anything well. Look, he was a friend of Aaron. That's the only thing you can say for him.
I remember this time last year, I was put on some of his film in Green Bay, and I just remember thinking, man, Jets fan, this is a guy Jets fans are going to love to hate, because that was like everything you saw. The only thing he didn't do in Green Bay that he did he did not drop as many passes in Green Bay, but it's like you said, he's a big guy who just doesn't come down with many catches. Now, I think I don't want to say he's an okay number 3 receiver. I guess what I'd say is that most number 3 receivers aren't really adding a ton of surplus skills to the table. So I'm not overly worried with him as the number 3, if he's the number 3 guy, just because, I mean, does he add anything that another receiver couldn't? No, but I don't think many number 3 receivers. I see a lot of trepidation about Lazard as the number 3 guy, but I mean, how many teams seasons are made or broken by the number 3 receiver?
If everyone's healthy, not many. But if one guy goes down and your number 3 receiver is as bad as Allen Lazard, I think it's a problem, especially with Mike Williams. We don't know what he's going to be. I mean, I'm optimistic, but I don't know that for a fact. He may be shot. He may be done. So we'll see. But if Allen Lazard has to slip in as a replacement for Mike Williams, we're in big trouble. So, yes, if everyone's healthy, it doesn't make a lot of difference. I still want to see him off the team. I don't want to even have a roster spot. For me, I don't see how he adds anything, and I'd rather try to develop somebody in that spot. I would like to see them cut him, even though it doesn't save any cap space. So, to me, it's lost money anyway. The money's already gone. Who cares? Let's get rid of him. But you're right. I don't think a number 3 receiver is ever going to make a difference if everyone's healthy. It just doesn't matter that much.
Yeah, well, it was like I said, you can never go wrong bashing Lazard in the Jets fan base. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. It's the NBA Finals kicking off, Celtics versus Mavericks. Sorry, Knicks fans. Looked like an exciting playoffs developing, but unfortunately the Knicks went down in the second round. There are, I know, a couple Jets Celtics fans, or maybe even a couple Jets Mavericks fans. If you're one of them, you should check out Gametime, because Gametime makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guaranteed, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. I've used the Gametime app several times myself. It's super convenient, super easy to use. I've gotten amazing deals on tickets right before my event started. All you do is you pull out your phone or mobile device, open up the Gametime app, and you won't believe some of the deals you can get. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word, no space, for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So the third round pick was Malachi Corley. The Jets were really really focused on getting him, apparently. I mean, they were trying to trade up high into the second round. And I mean, they said that he was the 4th ranked receiver on their board this year. I'm interested your take on the pick and your expectations for him as a rookie.
I'm not a fan. He was picked at number 65. Is that right? I think it was. They traded up to number 65. I think
it was the top pick in the 3rd round.
Yeah. So basically, almost a bottom end 2nd round pick. I don't know. This guy plays wide receiver to me like a running back, and that's not what you want in a wide receiver. I mean, to me, what they did was, and I don't know this for a fact, I'm just speculating, but it almost seems like they said, we want our Deebo Samuel because, we have our head coach is a 49ers, alumnus, and we want the same kind of guy. And they just like, well, this guy's going to be the same kind of guy. Nobody else plays like Deebo Samuel. I mean, so to say we're going to find a guy just like him is almost impossible. Just get a real receiver. This guy plays extremely physical, and he's going to run some people over. But how long can you play that way as a wide receiver? I think he's going to get beat up, and I think he's going to have a problem with running routes and stuff, at least in the beginning. I don't see him having a huge role this year. Maybe in the long run, maybe become another Deebo Samuel. But I think that's a big stretch, and I'm just not a fan of that at that draft position. Maybe lower, maybe in the 4th round, sure. But there are other guys on the board I'd rather have. So
I'm going to partially agree with you. As I did feel like it was a little early. The thing that bothered me was like them ranking him as the number 4 receiver on their big board. Because that's look, they could be right. I mean, that seems like an outlier to me. But I don't know that I agree entirely. I think that look, they'll be able to manufacture some touches for him this year. And look, receiver drafted in that range, like the mid 60s. That's never a guy you're really going to count on to do big things. I agree with from the standpoint that maybe they're looking for a Deebo type guy, but I don't know that he's that much like Deebo, because you have to remember back in, I think it was 2019 when he was drafted, Deebo Samuel was arguably the best route running receiver in that class.
Right.
Deebo Samuel happened to go to San Francisco, and they used him in all these different ways. But if Deebo Samuel was somewhere else and just a regular receiver, I think he'd be pretty good. You mentioned that he plays receiver like a running back, and he was a running back. He was converted to receiver, and he played an offense that's not a pro style offense at Western Kentucky, and essentially they played him like a running back. They threw a lot of screens to him, and like one of the things I'd look at if I were the Jets, and I've said this before on the show, is you think about where the touches or where there's room to get a guy who touches on offense. You've got Garrett Wilson's going to get a lot of targets. Mike Williams is going to get a lot of targets. Conklin's going to see his share of targets. They'll have some checkdowns to the running backs. You may hate it. I may hate it. Allen Lazard's not going anywhere. Rodgers likes him. I'd be surprised if look, maybe I'm wrong. I've been wrong on these things before, but I don't think Lazard's going anywhere. So there aren't a lot of I don't think there are going to be a lot of targets in the passing game available. And one of the things I'd look to do with him, especially as he's trying to learn the route trees, I'd give him some of the touches behind Breece Hall, because Breece Hall is going to be the number 1 back. But after him, there are question marks. I know they drafted 2 other guys, but if they view Corley as a guy who's dynamic with the ball in his hands, that physical, and he's got experience. He pretty much is a running back. He pretty much was a running back, and in college they converted him from being a natural running back to being a guy who essentially split out wide and played running back. I'd give him some carries out of the backfield and utilize his skill set that way.
Maybe. I don't know. I'm skeptical. One thing I'm concerned about is that they seem to be wanting to give him the kind of targets in the passing game that Breece Hall had last year. And if I'm the Jets, I don't want him taking targets away from Breece Hall. That's a big problem to me. If that's the way this is going to play out. Now, Breece Hall had, I believe, the most passing reception yards as a running back in the NFL last year. I think that's correct. So it's questionable how much more they can add to those sorts of targets on the team. So to me, if Malachi Corley is getting a lot of targets, he's probably taking targets away from Breece Hall, and that's a mistake. But we'll see. We'll see how it plays out.
I think the Breece Hall targets last year were a function of the rest of the offense being so broken, because I think a lot of those were just checkdowns where nobody other than Garrett Wilson could get open. I think Breece Hall's targets are going to go down. And What I'm saying is I'm not just talking about passing targets. I'm saying I'd give him carries out of the backfield.
Yeah, you mean in the jet sweeps, those kinds of things, or just straight up as a running back?
Snaps. You say he plays like a running back. Give him running back snaps.
You think he's better than the two running backs that they drafted?
Maybe. I mean, they drafted him higher. I mean, I'd give it a look.
Yeah, sure. There's no downside to trying him out that way. But it would be a little weird to draft two running backs and then have them leapfrog by the wide receiver they drafted. That would be a little strange. Then they basically drafted three running backs, which would be a terrible draft. Why would you draft three running backs ever?
Well, that's another issue. I'm saying that I think that they need to use them.
Right.
So let's talk about the running back position with the Jets. I think Breece Hall, obviously, it doesn't take a lot of great analysis to figure that Breece Hall is a guy who, is very important to this team this year. And I think about like a lot of the older quarterbacks who have succeeded in the league. Brady's an exception, but Brady's just an outlier for everybody. But, I think about, Brett Favre in Minnesota. One of the reasons he was so good is he had Adrian Peterson. You want to talk John Elway late in his career, Terrell Davis out in Denver. And I think Breece Hall, the kind of guy who could take some pressure off Rodgers. And I think like Rodgers, like maybe the goal is like, maybe he's like 85 to 90% as good as he used to be. And I think like the other 15% can be filled in by, the offensive line improvements or, the receivers making plays. And I think part of that 15% is, Breece Hall being great, because I do think Breece Hall has the potential to be like one of the few running backs in the league who can be a difference maker.
Yeah, Breece Hall is tremendous. Breece Hall could be the best running back in football soon. Christian McCaffrey is now, but he's had a lot of hits over the years. We'll see if he can keep it up. But getting back to Breece Hall, the running game is going to be hugely important. Aaron Rodgers has never been a guy who's been throwing 5,000 yards a season, nothing like that. He usually comes in 4,200, 4,300 yards, sometimes below 4,000 yards. The best way to use Aaron Rodgers is to have a strong running game. It's always been what he's used to in Green Bay. He's never been a guy who carries the team with just throwing 40 passes a game. If they don't have a huge running game, Aaron Rodgers is going to suffer, I think.
And I think, Breece Hall, it's interesting because last year, one criticism I've heard of Breece Hall is that all he does is hit home runs, which, is kind of like the old Buddy Ryan line about Chris Carter. All he does is catch touchdowns. The running back position, I mean, so much of like whether a play is successful or not is based on the blocking, and the Jets' run blocking was awful last year. I mean, there were games where they had so many injuries. They were playing guys who were practice squad level players. To me, like generally speaking, not 100% of the time, but like one of the things that I think is running a big run, like a 20-yard run, that's the run for me. That's the running back. Whereas like a 5-yard run is more the offensive line. It's a question of like, can you get what's blocked for you versus rip off more? And I think Breece Hall's a guy who's shown an ability to rip off more. And I think hopefully with a more consistent offensive line, you'll see better results. You'll see on a play-to-play basis. I think the home runs will still be there, but I think you'll also hopefully see more runs where he grinds out 5-6 yards instead of being stuffed for 2 or 3 because the line can't block.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. This line is going to make a big difference for Breece Hall. But I also think the chunk plays are what matter. Getting 3 or 4 yards is like, well, that's nice. But okay, being able to convert a 3rd and 1, yeah, that's important. But I'll tell you, the chunk plays are where you score. You score when you get 20-yard plays, 30-yard plays, and you're immediately in scoring position. That's when you score. You don't get how many 15-yard plays down the field for scores do we see? Not a lot. It's hard to have those kinds of drives. So the guy who gets 3 or 4 yards that's not a big value to me. I want those chunk plays. So yeah, what Breece provides, I'm perfectly happy with it, even if he doesn't get better on the regular 3 or 4 yard games, which I think he will.
I agree with some of what you said because I say this a lot. Like, there aren't a lot of times where offense can execute a 10-play scoring drive because even a great offense is going to screw up if you have to execute 10 straight plays. But I think the Jets' offense was so bad last year. I just think the Jets were such an outlier that I do think there's actually value in like having more 3, 4, 5, 6 yard gains because look, it's not the thing that drives an offense that makes it successful, but their inability to do that last year was the reason the offense was so bad. And I'd say like with a normal team, I'd agree with you completely. But for this particular team, I actually do think increasing the number of just overall successful plays is important.
Yeah, I don't agree with you. I mean, I don't disagree with you at all that way. I'm just saying the value in Breece Hall lies primarily in his home run ability. That's where you get the scoring drives. And I just so the fact that he wasn't always successful in the shorter plays, it's like I think he will be much more because they have a better line. But if he isn't, I'm still happy with what we got.
Yeah. Oh, agree. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think, that's one of the things that makes him special is that he was able to, I mean, I know counting stats aren't that important, but to almost get 1,000 yards behind that line was pretty impressive.
Yes.
I mean, to have an average that wasn't to have an average above like 3.5 yards behind that line was impressive. That was not a quality NFL offensive line. I think no matter what happens with the Jets, you've got two really special players to build around in this offense between Garrett and Brees.
Yeah. Brees, particularly to me, is has the potential to be the best in the NFL. I'm not sure Garrett Wilson will ever be that. He's a very good player. Brees to me has the potential, not that, but potential to be the best in the NFL.
Yeah, like one of the things I say is, like there were probably, I don't know, like maybe 30 receivers in the NFL who are difference makers, and Garrett's one of them. So like Garrett doesn't need to be a top 5 receiver to be a difference maker. Whereas like running back, you only have a couple of guys who really set themselves apart, and like Brees can be one of them. So I think like I agree completely with what you say, and I'll add the addendum that like Garrett doesn't need to be top 5 or even top 10. He's perfectly good if he's the 15th best receiver in the league. He makes a huge difference that way. Whereas Brees, if he's a top 5 running back, well, there might only be like 5 running backs or so who actually drive a team's success on offense, and he could be one of them.
Absolutely.
That's all for today's episode. Thank you for joining me. Thanks to my guest, MacGregor Wells, for joining the podcast as well. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode of Locked On Jets.